Yes, I've got here, Harry Wyatt. So let me just introduce this. As most of you know, we've been doing a lot of work on proactive care frameworks, and they're being implemented throughout our patch and geography regarding some of the long-term conditions. And it's been adopted very, very well. And this is a technology that helps complement that proactive monitoring. So I will hand over to Dr. Harry Wyatt, who's a GP, but also a co-developer of the tool Abtrace. Over to you, Harry.
Thanks, Nosheen. So I'm Harry Wyatt. I'm a GP and also do some work with Abtrace. If you can go to the next slide, Nosheen, the now famous phrase. So Abtrace as a company it's a small sort of health tech startup. Has done various work in hospital around sort of data analysis. And if you go on to the next slide, I think the strengths or sort of Abtrace's skill set really is about being able to analyze large amounts of data. So being able to look through health record sets from hospitals, from GP, make clinical recommendations, and we also have another branch that does sort of artificial intelligence analysis to look at sort of exciting things like that. Currently, sort of three main things that we're looking at. So we're looking at automating the monitoring of existing conditions. So this is our sort of remit we set ourselves for this is everything that GP practices do that is not necessarily the reactive, so not the coughs and colds, but all of the managing repeat medicines, the long-term conditions, the screening, the population health promotion, all of this kind of more predictable rules-based work that is nonetheless quite complicated and takes up a lot of practice's time. Trying to automate that, make it as efficient as possible, make it as equitable as possible so it reaches as many of the practice population and as easy for practices to sort of manage and track their progress. Two other branches of what we're working on at the moment that I'm not going to talk so much in this presentation. One is the early detection of long-term conditions. So we have a large grant from Innovate UK to do early cancer detection. The premise of this work is that we will take, or we have taken sort of structured and unstructured, so free text data from the health records and try and train an artificial intelligence to be able to identify what sort of patients are likely to be diagnosed with or referred for cancer imminently and try and pick them out of sort of that big soup of data if they haven't actually already been referred. So it will say to clinicians, this is a patient who statistically is very likely to need a 2-week wait referral. Do you want to have a look at them? So we're in the process of working through that, and the real crux of that is using the free text data, as studies show that although our coding has really improved, our SNOMED coding, the sort of frequency with which we code things like weight loss, night sweats, all these symptoms actually is still pretty low, so it's using the free text that's going to be needed for that. And then the third thing we're working on at the moment is around risk assessment of preventable conditions. So examples for this involve high risk of breast cancer, osteoporosis risk assessment, automating this, interacting with patients and trying to do that as efficiently as possible. If you can go to the next slide. So like I said, our sort of expertise that we have within the company is sort of complex analysis. So we have some sort of very clever mathematicians and data scientists who can do the machine learning and natural language processing. We're able to pull out sort of structured and unstructured data from the electronic health records. We have codified as many clinical rule sets as we can. So SPS around safe prescribing, all the long-term condition management ones, and then the very important but slightly more boring ones like QOF or the DESs or the LESs, locally commissioned services, whatever they're called locally to you. And then we've developed to go with that the patient communication tools, so the texting, the sending forms, and the sort of full transactional integration with things like EMIS and TPP to be able to write into the notes and pull information out. Next slide, please. So the monitoring tool. So this is sort of probably the main product I'm here to talk about today. So this is where I was saying about how in GP, if you have this workload that's broadly reactive and proactive, and the reactive is the coughs, colds, new symptoms, and the proactive is everything that we should, in a way, be able to predict that we need to do, but it gets very complicated. And for a patient with multiple conditions, multiple medications, who perhaps is in demographics where they need more sort of proactive care, so for example, a woman age 45, all of these things can overlap and mean quite a few different appointments and potential lost opportunities for efficiency. and also for lost patients who don't respond as easily to text messages or other recall systems. Our sort of example patient portrayed on this slide, for example, might be hypertensive, diabetic, asthmatic. They need, for each of those 3 conditions, they need various things doing, and they may end up visiting the practice multiple times for those. What the tool aims to do is facilitate them visiting the practice at the right time. When they visit the practice, albeit either triggered by the tool or opportunistically if they came for another reason, it should identify everything that they need doing for all of those things, and also make an intelligent decision about things that they might not need doing today, but perhaps they're going to need in 3 weeks, 6 weeks. And it will sort of make a sensible decision saying, although it's not due today, it will be in 3 weeks. We suggest you do it today to avoid that patient coming back. And the aim is that the patient has as much done on that visit and can then go the longest period possible without having to come back to the practice for any kind of predictable proactive need. Next slide, please. How it does this, so the tool accesses the full electronic health record data. It does a continuous background assessment of the whole population, looking against all those rule sets that I talked about, the QOF, DES, long-term conditions, prescribing, seeing for every patient what are all the different actions they need, when were they all last done, when will they next be due. For each patient, it then makes a standardized list saying if they came today, this is what we'd recommend. And those recommendations are these are overdue, these are due soon, these are done, don't worry about them. And all staff members can access that list for a given patient. It can also give you a population view of this, and that's where you see the whole practice and you can filter it out saying, I'm only interested actually in blood tests that are for repeat prescribing reasons or for high risk drug reasons, or I'm only interested, actually, we've got loads of, I don't know, ECG appointments. So I need to see all the patients who need ECGs. I want to see, regardless of the reason, and I want to order them in how overdue they are and how urgent they are. And then you can action that list, so you can generate it just into a list, or you can text the patients or whatever, however you want to action it. And you can set up automatic recalls to trigger when they become overdue for these different things. Next slide, please. What it looks like. So this is that single view for one patient. So this is an example for a patient. So it looks like this patient presumably has diabetes, you can see, and this is the view. So say you were a healthcare assistant who'd seen this patient and you open the tool, you'd see this. Everything in red is overdue. It would show orange if something wasn't overdue but was due soon, or green if something had been done recently and didn't need to be done today. So you can see it's grouped into, for HCAs broadly, the ones they tend to use are the biometrics, blood tests, and sometimes other. And if they hover over any of these things, they'll be able to see why it needs doing. So it'll say this needs doing because they're diabetic and hypertensive, for example, on blood pressure, and it hasn't been done in over a year. Suggest you do it today. And they can opt to put the data in directly into this form, and it will get coded straight into EMIS or TPP that way, and then picked up by whatever searches and reporting you use for QOF, DES, and locally commissioned services. Next slide, please. This is the population view. So this is probably going to be used more by managers or clinical leads, or sometimes nurses, whoever does sort of your QOF management or long-term condition management, or perhaps prescribing. And this is, as I was saying, it can show you your whole practice population. You can filter out what we call indications and actions. Indications being reasons you might need to do a test or an action. So those are long-term conditions, medications, and you can drill down into as much depth as you want. So you could say, I just want to pull out all the patients who take thyroid medicines and are overdue their thyroid function test. Or you could say all the patients who take thyroid medicines and any action they need for any reason, and then order them by how overdue they are. And you'll see you get your counts of how many patients are overdue, how many are due soon, and how many of them are just done. And then again, you can action these lists, so you can send text them all or pull them all out, and it will show you if you've sent them invitations and messages via our system, how they've been done that way. We are working on a few inequalities things here around the messaging, so trying to pick up automatically if a patient has a preferred language that's not English, and if possible, send them information in that language. And if patients have opted out of SMS messaging, notifying the practice that they're going to need to contact them by other means. That's sort of a work in progress. Next slide, please. We've been live in a couple of pilot sites, TPP so far, as EMIS is imminently going to give us the full access needed to run the product on EMIS practice, which we're quite excited about, but it's TPP that we've had working for a little while. The main impacts that we've seen from the data have been actually around appointment usage. So We've seen a big uptick in the number of blood tests and biometrics, particularly, and urine tests being done during HCA appointments that were booked for other things, or perhaps for only one blood test, the HCA is doing these other opportunistic tests with a good rate of appropriateness. And that reduces the overall number of HCA slots that are needed for monitoring. The two different practices have done different things with this spare capacity, but it definitely seems to drive efficiency. The rate of appropriately monitored medication has improved. So when you do a search to see of all the sort of common medicines, so ACE inhibitors, how many are overdue using EASE, thyroid medicines, how many are overdue thyroid function tests, all the DMARDs, all the high-risk drugs, that number of patients or proportion of patients overdue has dropped quite sort of satisfactorily. And we've got good sort of qualitative data from patients and clinicians from using it. Next slide, please. And this is some of the data that I was just describing. So the graph on the left shows the number of patients currently overdue a monitoring blood test for one of their medications over time, and the dotted line shows, I think, the rolling is the average from the year before, and the red line shows the trace from 2020. Obviously, interpreting any data in the last year or so has been somewhat difficult due to COVID, which is part of why we're trying to get some data scientists on board to help us with that element. But it both in the numbers and from the feedback from the practice, it seems to have really helped address that COVID backlog of monitoring tests that everyone saw back in sort of early summer, late spring. And we're hoping it's going to be really helpful as well now that we're bringing in flu jabs to try and opportunistically get as much done as possible there. The graph on the right, I'll speed up. This was another way we took to looking at it. So one of our main aims with this was the idea that patients for their repeat medicines, what we really wanted is when they ran out of a medicine, so let's say they got to their year's authorized issues of, I don't know, I keep going back to levothyroxine or ramipril, one of the main common drugs. The idea was that they really should have already had their tests done because they would have been triggered by the system at 11 months. They'd have gone and seen the HCA. The HCA would have, or the phlebotomist would have known exactly what tests they needed and done them. And then by the time they request their next script and it's not authorized, the clinician just goes on the system, sees that it's all been done and authorizes it, and it stops a loop where the clinician goes in, it's not been done, they give a short script, they say come back for a blood test, and they go through a few loops of that, which can get quite inefficient. And one of our measurements for that was how many prescriptions are issued by admin versus a prescribing clinician, because admins at these practices can issue authorized scripts, which means scripts where the monitoring tests have been done. And we did see quite a good drop off in the number of GPs having to issue just repeat medication scripts. There was a big increase in the number that were able to be issued by administrative staff because when they got renewed for a full year more often rather than just getting renewed for 2 weeks because they need a blood test and then to be looked at again. Next slide. This is the sort of boring but very important bit. So obviously we're handling patient data and we are also interpreting clinical guidelines, and we're also affecting processes and patient flow within a clinical system. So in terms of data, we're fully compliant with everything that we should need to and want to be in terms of NHS Digital. So ICO, we've got various ISO and then lots of long numbers and acronyms. You can tell that I don't really head up this part. We get lots of external verification. So we've got Cyber Essentials, we get penetration tested, which is where you pay a company to basically try and break your system. We have an MHRA CE mark for clinical safety of the product, and various other things. If you're interested in this side of things, let me know and I'll put you in touch with the person who really understands it. Next slide. In terms of pilots, we're quite keen to take on a lot more pilot sites now that we've kind of got it running and got it working and are quite confident. Currently we've got TPP. We expect by October to have EMIS. I don't think anything should really stop that at this point. We are essentially figuring out value. So what we're keen to do really is to have pilots for at least 6 months. If practices are willing to do quite a lot of data assessment to see what savings there have been in terms of appointments, what efficiencies have gained, what clinical safety has been improved, and then use that as a means to sort of calculate what would be a sensible sort of price point after that point. So definitely for at least the first 6 months, we're talking about free pilots as long as practices are willing to work with us and sort of share data so that we can assess the sort of efficacy and impact of the product. I can't remember if there's another slide. These are the other projects that I talked about earlier. They're not really the remit of this talk, but if people are interested, do let us know via Nosheen. CanDetect is the project looking at free text analysis of primary care and hospital records to detect cancer earlier. And Preventable is the project looking at implementing large-scale NICE guidelines like early detection, assessment for familial breast cancer or high risk of fragility fracture assessment of large populations. That's the last slide. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Harry. That was great. Really, really useful, especially for our audience, because we're all focusing on long-term conditions proactive monitoring. We've got a few questions in the chat box. I've got here from, let's start from the top. Gareth Cairns, how feasible would it be to use your free text analysis to find structure and flag free text in patient online forms like AccuRx? And could you use this tool to audit for symptoms of asthma?
It's certainly feasible, and you certainly could. I would say with all free text analysis, you've got sort of two main types. You've got one where you essentially give it lots and lots of phrases, and you say, look for these, which isn't overly intelligent, but could work. And then you've got one where you really use natural language processing and machine learning. The latter, you would need to train it, so you need a good amount of data set. For a common condition like asthma, and given the length of time we've now been using forms, fancy forms as I call them, we probably do have enough data to start training an algorithm. I guess you just want to be really clear what your aim is. Are you trying to get a machine that would be able to risk assess an incoming asthma review form, I guess, red, amber, green, and what would be the cost benefit of that? So certainly feasible, would be an interesting project.
But the question comes from two separate places. One is, could we find patients in your list that have asthma that you haven't seen yet, haven't recognised yet? And the other one is, we've had a lot of requests around patients want unstructured forms where they can just tell you the problem and press submit. GPs want structured forms where they can take the data and assess and prioritise. If the natural language processing can allow you to take unstructured data and structure it to do risk assessment and triage, that would be the better world. That's really where that's coming from.
Yeah, so they're two quite different products. So the first one, definitely it's kind of the same principles as the CanDetect product. So you would give the machine a whole load of notes labeled as asthma and not asthma for certain, and then you would let it try and identify from unknown sets of notes which ones most match the asthmatic or the non-asthmatic cohort, and give you a sense of how definite it would be. That could be trainable, and you definitely would want, I would say, you'd almost certainly want to use the free text analysis for that, because coded data tends to be used already. It's quite sort of ingrained in QoF rules and various other quality improvement searches that exist. So if you want to improve it, free text is probably the next step. For the converting free text single white box responses from patients into structured data, I agree. That's exactly what patients want versus what GPs want. It's something we get asked about quite a lot. It can be done. I think it's about figuring out the use cases and getting the users really clear on exactly what they want from these things. It's not something we're currently working on at the moment.
Thank you. We've got another question from Wayne Douglas from North East London, CCG. Free text detecting for cancer patients, is it based on NICE guidance, so NG12, and can it be tweaked locally for local pathways? Has it already been tested and embedded into clinical systems?
So to answer that in reverse, it hasn't been tested and embedded into clinical systems. This is sort of quite a big project at the start, and at the moment it's really just looking for what the signal is. In terms of the NG12 symptoms, sorry, my computer's gone funny. NG12 is what we based our initial analysis about what was the frequency of symptoms being coded versus in the free text, which picks up the fact that actually there's a lot of stuff in the free text that's not coded, which is why we expect better signal from free text. We will probably do two levels of analysis on the data. One is looking really just at NG12 symptoms. So like I was saying earlier, when you give the machine a bit of a nudge saying this is what we're looking for, and then another will be really just letting the machine look for whatever it wants. So if we can give it enough, well, it's actually processing at the moment, but when we give it enough data from a cohort of patients who went on to get cancer or be referred for cancer and those who didn't, it should start to identify its own signals for what are the unique features of the cancer cohort. We would expect that to be NG12 symptoms, but it's also possible that it will show up other factors that it says are strongly associated with cancer. And then there's going to be obviously quite a laborious process of assessing that and cleaning that. So it's early days.
Brilliant, brilliant. Thank you. So there's a couple of other comments, but what I would say for time's sake, we need to move on to the next speaker. If I could gather any questions that anybody has either in the chat function or email to me separately, then we can put these to Abtrace and get back to you with those queries, if that's okay. And just as Harry mentioned, the 6-month pilot is a great opportunity to use something that will definitely help manage these proactive patients. If this is something of interest to you, please do get in contact with myself or a member of the commercial team, and we can facilitate that going forward. Thank you so much, Harry.